Welcome to the Astral podcast. Today we're talking with researcher Jeffrey Kotyk, which is going to introduce us for a little bit of his work and tell us of his latest research. Jeffrey had his PhD dissertation on Buddhist astrology and astral magic in the Tang Dynasty from the Leiden University, and he is an expert researcher on the Oriental traditions of horoscopic astrology. He is studying the transmission from East to East and back again of all the techniques and the practices of astrology in the Far East. Welcome to the Astra.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. So, can you tell us a little bit about your research interests or your current work?
Right, so my current work in the area of the history of astrology and astronomy, as you say, documents the transmission of astrology first from India into China, and then I also look at the transmission of astrology from China into Japan, medieval Japan. But it's not just Indian astrology that we're looking at, we're also looking at the history of Persian and Indo-Iranian astrology into China, as well as the iconography. So this has been another field that I've been delving into, which is the iconography of astrology. So when we say astrological iconography, we're referring to the representations of the zodiac signs, the planets, and also the lunar mansions, and also some of the other figures that you see, like directional deities and so forth. And over the course of the last several years, what I've discovered is that there are icons that are very clearly Indian in origin, and they correspond to descriptions of the planets in texts like the Agni Purana and other texts. But then there's also a set of icons that we find in China and Japan that have parallels with what we see in the early Islamic tradition and also the medieval Persian tradition. So I've argued that these sort of icons that we see that are shared between the Islamic world and China probably have an Iranian heritage behind them, but I haven't been able to conclusively prove that. Also, I've been looking at the history of horoscopy, in particular the casting of birth charts and the reading of those charts in China, going to about the 16th century. So what I've discovered is that horoscopy became very popular from the 9th century. And then once you get to the 15th, 16th century, there's massive compendia compiled in the range of dozens and dozens of chapters that go into reading charts and also very fine techniques on identifying and analyzing planetary positions. And there's also a lot of Chinese native elements that got mixed in with this late tradition, but you can still see within that sort of horoscopy elements that were very clearly brought over from I wouldn't say the Western world, but I would usually say the Indo-Iranian world. And so horoscopy was just as popular in medieval and late imperial China as it was in Europe. And one of my recent papers that I published compared the 12 houses in the Lot of Fortune in William Lilly's work from the 17th century with what we see in a 16th century Chinese astrologer's work, Wan Minying. And so what I discovered was that if you compare the two authors on just the doctrine of the 12 houses alone, what you find is that they were very, very similar. They actually had more common features with one another than differences. Though the major difference in the Chinese side is that the 12th house is concerned with material appearance of the native, and so it's not necessarily, strictly speaking, about misfortune. And that's anomalous in the history of astrology. So, but generally speaking, you have like the triplicity rulers, you have the 12 houses, you have all the fundamental doctrines and techniques of horoscopy in China. And also it seems that the transmission of horoscopy into China starting around the year 800 was really kicked off with the translation of material based on Dorotheus of Sidon's work. Now, the text that they translated was probably different from what was translated into Arabic by Al-Tabari, but there's enough common features between the two. So when you compare the fragments of the Dorotheus translation in Chinese with David Pingree or Benjamin Dyke's translations of the Arabic text, Arabic translation by Al-Tabari, you can identify a lot of common elements, common features. So it's very clear that there was this transmission of, I guess you could say even Hellenistic astrology through this Iranian intermediary into China around the year 800. So it's a very exciting and developing field. And then if you go even deeper into this, you can see that around the 14th century, they were translating Arabic astrology directly into Chinese, such as the Al-Mutkal. And so this is something that hasn't been investigated at great detail. But now that we have digital sources as well, everything is digitized, it's getting increasingly easier to search through massive texts and to identify different astrological doctrines and to see how they were used. And then on top of that, there's also the Japanese tradition called Tsukuyodo, which existed from around the late 10th century until about the early 14th century. Unfortunately, we have some extant horoscopes, including the natal charts, but also the analysis of the astrologers that are preserved in Japan. And there's also a lot of handwritten manuscripts in Japan that haven't been digitized. And I hope in the future to have access to these documents, because then I can translate them and explain more about the tradition of East Asian astrology. So that's basically my my research for the moment.
Oh, it is a lot. It is a lot. I am so what we are talking about is different lines of tradition in the east, in the far east, so to say, in all this region. But well, I have many questions, and I think I'm sure Louise has too. But one of the things that I noticed is you said that the Japanese tradition existed between a certain period of time, and then what happened? It was extinct or disappeared somehow?
Yeah, it seems to have disappeared with the collapse of the aristocracy in around the 14th century or so. So there was a lot of ongoing wars in Japan around that time. And it seems that the aristocracy which supported these professional astrologers, and most of them were also Buddhist monks, so the aristocracy which supported them either collapsed or was replaced. Mm-hmm. And they were also practitioners of astro magic. So if somebody had an unfavorable horoscope, then the astrologer monk would also perform rituals, apotropaic rituals, in order to ward off those ill-fated omens. So it faded away, and it wasn't entirely forgotten, however. So a lot of their works and some of their rituals and so forth are preserved in various sources. Japan is sort of a really great repository of all this medieval culture, because there are monasteries and even some private libraries preserved documents going back many, many centuries. And because a lot of these monasteries were not harmed during all the civil wars and so forth, and because Japan was never successfully invaded by a foreign power, a lot of these documents are still in great condition, and they're still often privately owned. So it's hard to get a hold of these manuscripts too, because they're privately owned and they're not publicly cataloged either. But I know they exist because I've seen references to them. So
we're treasures.
Yeah, it's a great
right. I hope one day somebody can say, hey, I have a whole book of horoscopes from the medieval period. Can you look at this? Can you tell me about this or translate them? Because we only have 2 extant horoscopes from Japan, like fully extant horoscopes, and we have some fragments of horoscopes in China as well. So we're piecing together the tradition of East Asian horoscopy from multiple sources. Mm-hmm. And then in Japan, I mean in China too, it seems that astrology continued on even after the 16th century. And then now if you talk to astrologers in Taiwan and Hong Kong, they'll often say that their tradition, they were taught by a tradition that goes back, 500, 600 years. But it's hard for me to verify their claims, because you could, even one generation ago, you could have gotten a hold of all the texts from earlier centuries and studied the material yourself and used it. And so it's the modern traditions of astrology in China and Japan also have been influenced by Western astrology, because modern Western astrology has also been translated into Japanese and Chinese. So it's it's a very complex history, and
Exactly.
there's not enough people researching this.
Yes. Well, within my research, as you know, it's about Jesuits and their relationship with astrology. And one of the items I've encountered is they're going to China and eventually Japan, and there's some kind of an interchange with the Western tradition and their own. So, and it's still unclear exactly how influential is this new information coming in. We know that it is in terms of calculation, new instruments, new conceptions of cosmos that are important at that time. But what you're saying is that there's already an incredible dense and ancient tradition coming from the West in much earlier periods already existing there. So probably it would be interesting to know more about that reception. How is
even around the year 800, there was Nestorian Christians who, it seems, who were responsible for translating astrology and also some amount of astronomy into Chinese. So the Christian Church, the Nestorian Christian Church, which was identified with the Persians at the time, was a prominent, I guess, intermediary for this knowledge to be translated. And then later on, you have the Arabic materials and possibly Persian materials too translated into Chinese, and presumably the people who were translating this in like Mongol and Ming Dynasty China, they probably would have come from Central Asia, or they might have been Turkish, and most of them had Muslim names too. So there's this strong contribution to the history of science in China that we owe to the Muslim peoples, the Muslim astrologers in the imperial period.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it's never as simple as we think. It's
right.
Quite complex, and really it places astrology in a much more
wider context.
But right. Yeah, so it's difficult to separate between East and Western traditions. It's all
like ideas
coming in,
travel and people travel. But there is a question I have to ask, because non-historians, I'm sure they will want to know. Because when we think of Chinese astrology today, it is a completely different system. And it's the first thing that comes to mind for non-historians when we say Chinese astrology. They would think of these, the year of the rat and the year of the dragon, and it's a completely different system. And it has actually not to do directly with the stars. It's more like a cycle. And it's also very interesting. But what you are telling is that the astrology as we know it survived and actually thrived in China and other surrounding countries. But there is also this tradition. So how does these two traditions articulate, or are they just parallel lines, or they mix, or how they live together, how they manage to live together?
Well, judging from the extant materials, the tradition of horoscopy could be mixed together with the Chinese hemerology, so the study of auspicious days on the calendar. And so they could do both of those simultaneously. And I think the other thing we have to understand is that when we say Chinese astrology, and what people in the Western world, in Europe and North America, understand as Chinese astrology is what has been translated into Western languages, into European languages. And if you go to Taiwan and China, you actually see that they do have forms of astrology that focus on the positions of the planets, and they have birth charts and so on. So I think it's called Tsukuyodo. And there is this tradition, and one of my friends practices this professionally in Montreal, but none of this has been translated into English. So when we say like year of the rat, year of the bull, and so on, that's also commonly understood in East Asian culture, in Chinese culture. So everybody knows the animal under which they were born every year, and everybody is supposed to have a certain personality based on that. So, and then they also observe like the Lunar New Year, and also the seasonal markers and so forth, and like you eat the moon cakes for autumn festival and so on. So there also is that tradition, but that's actually, as you say, that's more hemerology and not horoscopy. So, but they definitely had a very strong tradition of horoscopy throughout from at least the 9th century until around the 16th, 17th century, as far as the historical record shows. And even Marco Polo, when Marco Polo went to China, he records that there were all these different nationalities of astrologers practicing in the capital. So there were Chinese astrologers, Turkish, Muslim, and maybe even, I haven't read it, but maybe there might even have been some Mongols, because we also know that the Mongols inherited traditions of astrology. They might have also received some of that from the Tibetan side. And Tibetan astrology is another area of study that isn't as well documented as it should be. And I really hope somebody in the future who is good with Tibetan can write a good book that surveys all of the horoscopy that's done in Tibet traditionally. And so in Dharamsala, that's where the Dalai Lama lives in India, there's actually a school of astrology, and they learn how to calculate positions of planets by hand on paper still, so they don't use computers. They do the very traditional training.
Well, that's
So yeah, so in a lot of extent, most of these traditions are still living traditions. It's not,
Definitely.
yeah. So continue. That's
and
interesting.
it is, I have to say this again, it's fascinating to see how they are all somehow connected, although they all have different specificities according to their different cultures. But the idea of the correlation between the movements of the planets and events on Earth, it's there somehow in different ways.
Yes.
So,
And I'll just now question that arose me is that how do they, for example, here we have a very strict connection between astrology practice and the cosmology, usually Aristotelian-based, with all the explanations of why the influence of the planets exists in a certain way. How does that interact, for example, in China? I know probably in different places it would be different, with their own philosophy and cosmoconception, which is comparatively different from ours.
the four elements, all the things, yeah.
Well, definitely the horoscopy in China didn't inherit any of the Aristotelian cosmology, such as the spheres and so on, although those are mentioned in the translations of Arabic astrology in the 14th century. Those were never incorporated into Chinese cosmology. Chinese cosmology until basically, I think the 17th century was largely flat Earth based. They in the year 718, there was an Indian astronomer in China, Siddhartha Gautama, and he translated a manual of mathematical astronomy called the Navagraha Karana, and that's a reconstructed translation of the title. And this manual of mathematical astronomy specifies how to calculate latitude, and you need to know your latitude to properly predict eclipses and other movements of the celestial sphere. So they were exposed to this concept of latitude and spherical Earth cosmology, but it never actually filtered into mainstream Chinese astronomy, which was dominated, it was monopolized by the court at the time. So Chinese astronomers in subsequent centuries never made reference to this concept of latitude or spherical Earth cosmology. Now, how did they view the planets? Well, as you mentioned, they had the idea of the 5 elements. So, for example, Venus is the metal star, and Saturn is the earth star. And originally, they viewed them as just material bodies that signaled the will of heaven. And it was from that you could ascertain and determine various omens in the sky. And that's native Chinese court omenology or native Chinese court astrology. And then with the introduction of Buddhism into East Asia, they also incorporated some Indian cosmology. So once the Indian materials start talking about the planets, they always view them as the Graha. And Graha are sentient deities. So, and also in the anthropological depictions of them, they're usually depicted as people. So, you know, Venus is well, especially in the Indo-Iranian tradition, she's always playing some sort of lute or guitar-like instrument. And you could do various rituals to appease these deities. And from there, you could also modify your fate. So the cosmology was very much rooted in, I guess you could say, a religious worldview. And even with the translation of Ptolemaic astrology from Arabic in the 14th century, it seems the astrologers still continued to view the planets as somehow sentient deities. And they also deified also the lunar stations and the zodiac signs. So in Taoist literature, you have various lines, verses that will say, like, you know, hail Cancer, hail Leo, hail Sagittarius, and then it also goes to the lunar mansions. So they were also viewed as deities. And I think that carried over from Indian religious traditions, particularly Buddhism, that saw the nakshatras, the lunar mansions, as deities embodied in the stars. But we don't have the Aristotelian worldview until the Jesuits in the 16th, 17th centuries.
Yes, that's why I asked you. I know that came into that introduction of that cosmic conception much, much later. So it was interesting to see. It's interesting to see the astrology working without the Aristotelian, because I think for someone who studies Western astrology, it's very clear that the two are almost inseparable. Mm-hmm. But you can see from this out branch and this own development that they can be completely separated, and there can be a practice. The practice can still exist within more or less similar, or at least fundamental the same fundamental principles, but with a different conception of the universe attachment. So it's quite interesting, and it separates. It separates the two things.
The two concepts, yes. It is so interesting to see the concept of astrology, but like the rest in a different culture, with a different, completely different tone. And also this replies to my next question, that was, so if astrology already existed in China, why were they translating astrological manuals? But now, well, okay, now I know.
Well,
now I
from what I know, and perhaps you can add something to it, the idea that I understand from the Jesuits later on is because they're introducing calculation, mathematics, and more precision.
And probably Aristotelic concept.
And Aristotelic concept. And in terms of astrology, what I understand is that they are also trying to introduce Western astrology as something which is more accurate in terms of, speaking, and prediction than what they have currently and that they're available in.
That brings us to another question. I'm sorry, we are like bombarding.
Please.
But this is interesting. How were they calculating? Did they have, I think they have tables, but were they also observing directly? How were they calculating the horoscopes?
Well, it depends on the culture in place. It seems that the common astrologers would have used ephemerides, the tables indicating planetary positions, and then they would have done a bit of mathematics, arithmetic, to calculate the location of the planet on a given day at a given hour. However, their way of calculating the ascendant is very, very different from how it was done in the West, because basically they didn't actually calculate the position of the ascendant most of the time. What they did was they looked at the position of the sun. So the Chinese divide the day into 12 units of time. And so people could follow the course of time in the night using water clocks. And then during the daytime, they might have actually used the drums, because the city would announce, okay, this hour has passed, and they would drum, and then people would keep track of the daytime hours like that too. And so your parents would remember that the hour you were born, because that was important for numerology. And then you would tell the astrologer the hour of your birth, and then they would put the sun in the point in the sky that would correspond to that hour. However, that doesn't necessarily mean great accuracy, because it varies over time, right? So these weren't strictly defined seasonal hours, and they weren't aligned with the equinox either, it seems. So it was kind of approximate. And as a result of that too, the ascendant doesn't take into account long and short ascension of the different zodiac signs. But they weren't actually calculating zodiac signs, they were actually positioning the planets relative to the 28 lunar stations, the native Chinese lunar stations, which equal 365.25 degrees in total, not 360 degrees.
Wow.
So, and then they divided the 28 lunar stations into roughly 12 equally divided sections, which correspond to the 12 zodiac signs. So it was very, very approximate. Mm-hmm. So when the Jesuits showed up and they said, "Hey, I'll show you how to calculate the exact degree of the ascendant," that was far greater accuracy than what the local astrologers were doing. That being said, I'm pretty confident that the Muslim astrologers were probably using arithmetic to calculate the exact degree of the ascendant. But that sort of mathematics wasn't really, it was translated into Chinese a few times, but for some reason the Chinese astronomers just never really adopted it. If you look at the manuals of astronomy over the centuries, they weren't actually incorporating these foreign concepts so much. In some cases, they took some elements that were useful for them, like being able to calculate the position of the lunar apogee, and also the nodals and so the northern and southern nodes. And from that, then they could also make better eclipse predictions. So Chinese astronomy was also augmented by foreign elements, but at the same time, too, there was a limit to what they adopted from it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that will explain then the criticism that the Jesuits do, that state that they cannot calculate, for example, eclipses as accurately as they can because they're lacking some mathematical elements. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good.
And the reason why they accepted a few elements and rejected or ignored some others, it's also interesting to try to understand why were they open to some ideas and not to others. I don't know, maybe this has to do with mathematics.
Well, it had to do with the translation of those mathematics into Chinese was different. Mm-hmm. So it was potentially difficult for them to translate some of that into Chinese, and for the Chinese astronomers to be able to make use of it, because they actually the Chinese would do their calculations with counting rods, and they would note that their notation system was different. They weren't using Arabic or Sanskrit numerals. Now, there were Indian astronomers and then also later Muslim astrologers who would have been using numerical notations that we would be familiar with, but then the native Chinese astronomers weren't using that system. Mm-hmm. So
it would be difficult to translate one thing into the other. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there was even criticism of the Navagraha Karana, which I said was translated in 718, and when there was a debate whether this text had been plagiarized by one of the Chinese astronomers named Yixing. He was a monk. And after he died, the Indians at court, some of them accused Yixing of plagiarizing the Navagraha Karana. But then the court, when they tried to actually use this in a practical way, they said it actually wasn't accurate. They said the other calendars were far more accurate than this one, but that could have been because they didn't actually understand how to use those mathematical formulas like sine function and calculating the ascendant and spherical earth cosmology and latitude and these concepts. So there wasn't a really strong push to modify native Chinese astronomy. The other thing is that the Chinese were always deferential to the ancients, so they would always defer to the ancients. And if the ancients were wrong about something, they would kind of frame it in such a way, they would say that, well, they weren't wrong entirely, but we just need to update things a bit because times have changed. Mm-hmm. So to completely cast away the old methods and to incorporate this new form of mathematics from the West would have been quite revolutionary. And they just didn't do that in the end. They only took some parts of it, and you can see that incorporated into the astronomy of the Chinese, especially starting around the year 800.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think mathematics is always the acceptance of mathematics and the concepts that go with it. The numerals, the way that mathematics is expressed in different languages and cultures, always gives this advantage of a precision from one culture to the other, which is quite interesting in this case. And as you said, the Arabs and the Indians themselves have good mathematics already, so those should be able to calculate with certain precision. Now I have a question, and how is the representation of an horoscope following the horoscopic tradition in the Chinese context? Does it have the same kind of diagram that we see in the West, or is it something completely different?
Well, it seems that the early ones that would correspond, well, the ones that we have from Japan, which are based on the Chinese model, were circular, with 12 segments representing the 12 houses. And then later what you find is rectangular horoscopes. And they're different from the sort of triangular diamond-shaped ones that we see in the Islamicate and Persian traditions and Turkish traditions. So it seems that they started off with circular ones and then they moved on to using rectangular ones. The rectangular ones, I imagine, might have been also due to foreign influence.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we see something similar, I think, in Hellenistic period, where they have the circular initial, the older ones are circular,
Kind of
and then move
circular.
on to the
Rectangular
square.
or like the diamond.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
I was also curious about something that you said right in the beginning of our conversation about the 12th house being the physical possessions or
Yeah,
physical.
physical appearance.
That is strange because in Western astrology,
It's completely
the first house is it's related somehow with the physical appearance. Could this be like a mistranslation, or do you think it's something else?
It could have been. It could have been. It's a very good question, and I can't really explain why this anomaly exists. So in Chinese horoscopy, the first house is always associated with fate, but that's not necessarily your physical appearance. That's just your fate,
Yeah.
right? And then the 12th house gets associated with physical appearance. I could have my speculation would be is that so the sun is rising from the east and it starts in the east, and the first house that it would be passing through would be the time of your formation as a fetus and also as an infant.
Mm-hmm.
And then as the sun goes over the midheaven and then downwards, that would represent the latter parts of your life. So my thinking is it might have something to do with the position of the sun relative to the eastern horizon.
Something which is appearing and rising, so
right.
As well, okay, yeah, it's
Could
also
be, yes.
it could be, yes.
But does it also mean like unfortunate events or limitations? Like, does the 12th house also accumulates other meanings, or this meaning?
The literature that I've looked at tends to just express it as appearance in the Chinese tradition.
But that's
so. Yeah, so like the 6th house is understood as slaves and servants,
yes,
and that's an unfortunate one. And also the 8th house, which is usually associated with illness and great misfortune. The greatest misfortune is actually the 8th house in Chinese horoscopy, not the 12th house.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, also in Western astrology, it is associated with death.
In that regard, it's quite
Yes.
in alignment with the
right
tradition, the original Western tradition. So yes, okay.
Well, I think
but most, as my paper points out, though, most of the concepts of the 12 houses are identical with what you see in the Western traditions and also the Arab traditions. It would really help if we had access to Sasanian, Iranian literature on astrology, but almost none of it exists now. So we can't really do so many comparisons.
Yes, because there's the missing link between the transmission there, which is quite sad.
And we know that the Persians were really great astrologers, and they very much supported astrology. They were professional astrologers. It seems that a lot of the Sasanian elite astrologers were probably literate in Greek. So they had translated the Greek literature and some Indian literature into Persian, into Pahlavi, but some of the elites in the aristocracy also read Greek, because like the Sasanians were to some extent Hellenized as well, and so they had access to Greek learning too. So, and then in the eastern regions there would have been people presumably who were bilingual in Sanskrit as well, and they had also invited Sanskrit astrologers to the court. So we know that in the early period, like after the 220s, there were translations of literature from Sanskrit and Greek into, and possibly even Syriac too, into Persian. But unfortunately, just none of this literature is extant, and we just don't have access to it.
Yeah, but they do show us that the mixture of traditions and even references in geographical references is so great that it becomes very difficult to point. This is exactly the origin, because there can be earlier exchange, later exchange, and it's without the manuscripts or without the text, it's very difficult to know accurately who is proposing a certain tradition. or more at least for the major central corpus of the doctrine.
And that also leads to the question of where the Arabic lunar mansions come from, the al-manazil. So some people have argued that it's based on an indigenous system of timekeeping relative to the stars, but then others have said that it was probably carried over from India because there's 28 lunar mansions, 28 manazil. But then you also have the lunar stations attested in the Pahlavi text, the Buddhist, which is the creation myth. It's a document that explains the creation myth of Zoroastrianism. And so what that shows you is that the Zoroastrians and the Persians had brought in the lunar stations. And the question is, did the Arabs come up with this concept independently, or was it inherited from the earlier Persian tradition, or did they learn it from the Indians? So that's another big question.
Yes. Yes, because we keep finding parallels and similarities, and then it is extremely difficult to understand which one came first. But also, it's for me, one of the great joys of being an historian. It's kind of something that we keep finding new questions and new interesting questions.
And as I said before, nothing is ever simple. It's never direct. It always has this complexity and this interesting complexity, which makes the studying and the research much more enjoyable and maddening at some point, I must say.
Right, and there's always going to be debates about this because of the paucity of evidence. We don't always have enough evidence to determine conclusively something. So there'll be a lot of theories that will be ongoing probably for decades, if not centuries from now on.
Yes. Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Well, a lot to do.
A lot to do, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely do.
Your paper was quite interesting in the way that you compared two completely different traditions. Later, both are later. So you're comparing William Lilly's definition of the houses and use of the part of fortune with,
Wan Minying.
Wan Minying, yes, exactly, who also is writing in Chinese a similar text, so comparable text in terms of use. And it's quite amazing. The parallels are there. You can see perfectly well that they're speaking about the same tradition, the same root corpus of doctrine, but then with the expected differences in
cultural differences.
But then there's little features too, like, for example, William Lilly does not reverse the law of fortune,
yes,
but the Chinese tradition does.
So
what that tells you is that in the Chinese tradition is that their law of fortune and their definition of the lots was probably not derived from Ptolemaic astrology. So although the Al-Mudkal incorporates a lot of material from the Tetrabiblos, and that was translated from Arabic in the 14th century, that text, it's quoted in later Chinese astrological texts, but it wasn't terribly influential in China. So, and then the definition of the lots that we have dated going back to the Tang Dynasty is largely identical with what Dorotheus of Sidon gives us. So it seems that the Chinese definition of the lots came more from Dorothean astrology than Ptolemaic. So,
which gives us a very good example of how the fact that certain traditions are emphasized and others not, the end result, development of a certain technique or a certain practice, which is also quite interesting because they didn't have all the revision that we had here in the 16th and 17th century, of which Lilly is one example, exactly. So, So
it's also that the Chinese, they never really had skeptics or critics of astrology in any great number. So the Chinese weren't challenged about the efficacy of astrology. Whereas in the Christian world, for example, the Christians constantly had to justify the legitimacy of astrology. But then in China, because they viewed the planets either as immaterial forces, which are also documented in ancient sources, or they viewed them as sentient deities, in Chinese polytheism, there wasn't a question of whether this was sacrilege or heresy. They just viewed, they were comfortable with either worldview, and you see both worldviews expressed in the literature as well. and they didn't see it as controversial. So if metal star and Venus, one of them can be material, one of them can be a goddess. It's polytheism, so they were willing to see divinity in nature anyway, like mountains and rivers and all sorts of deities in the natural world. So it wasn't such a great leap for them to view the planets also as deities. Exactly. And that's also why Claudius Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, I think, became so popular in Europe, was because it didn't assume that the planets were divinities. It just said that they're immaterial forces. Mm-hmm. And then they have these various occult influences on us over the course of time.
Yes, it gives a more, as you said, material, yes, right, which is more agreeable to Christianity and to the conception of faith and a unique God. So things will tend towards that position. While in India, China, where you have polytheism, it's not an issue. So things develop, completely different and with more freedom in that regard. On the mechanism, if we can call it,
right,
work. Yeah, that's also a very interesting topic. Is how religion and religious thought or philosophical thought, if we want, also affect the way certain practices develop in different civilizations.
Right.
So here is a good example.
And I think the other area of research that we can't ignore is historical astral magic, because astral magic, especially texts like Picatrix, the translation of the Gayat al-Hakim, makes great use of electional astrology. So in order to properly make a talisman, you have to be able to calculate the positions of the planets relative to the ascendant exactly. But also the tradition of Picatrix flourished in Europe. The earlier tradition also flourished in the Islamicate world as Gayat al-Hakim, and then there's other texts as well. And from that perspective, however, the planets are definitely spirits. So they're even in a monotheist society, you could have these astrologers who viewed the planets as spirits, and then they had to justify that they're not satanic, that they're not demonic. But they, over the course of the centuries, they got away with this for the most part, until the Inquisition started, banging on people's doors, and you could be put on trial in the Inquisition if you just had a copy of the Picatrix. This is what I've read. So the astrology and the astromagical text too is very important to study. And if you compare some of that astrological magic that you see in texts like the Picatrix with what you see in some Chinese texts, there's very strong parallels. Like in Picatrix, it says for Mars you burn red sandalwood incense, and then in Chinese it says the same thing. And also for Saturn that you burn styrax, which is a form of incense, and then in the Chinese it says that as well. So there's a lot of strong parallels between the two. So I think astromagic should also be studied alongside the history of astrology, because astromagic is astrology, it's just astrology plus magic.
Practical.
Yeah,
I think the other text that you were mentioning is the Bethran of Purity.
I'm not familiar with that text.
It's the, what is the Arabic name, is Ikhwan al-Safar.
Okay.
Well, it is also, it's kind of a group of anonymous practitioners. They call themselves Muslim. They call themselves the Bethran of Purity. And they left a series of letters, very, well, more or less similar to the Picatrix. But also regarding all sorts of astrological practices and talismans. And is also philosophical also, but they preserve this knowledge in a way. And there is other interesting something that I also find very interesting. It's the Nabatean tradition.
Oh, right.
They were also regarding agriculture, but also magical, so to say, magical agriculture and rituals. So this is also a very interesting area of study. So yeah.
There's also an understudied area, which is Syriac astrology. So in the Syriac language, there's a number of extant documents that deal with astrology, and also their medical literature, such as like the so-called Book of Medicines. There's several dozen pages that just deals with astrology. And
they are not studied, properly studied.
Well, I mean, Well, when I talk to Syriac specialists, they are aware of their existence, but nobody studies them because most people who read Syriac are interested in the history of the Syriac church. They're not necessarily interested in all of this astrology. So there's few people who can, in the academic world, who read Syriac to begin with. But to find somebody who does Syriac plus astrology and wants to go through these manuscripts it's very rare. Let's just say. So I'm hoping one day a Syriac scholar can tell us what's in all these manuscripts, which are cataloged. They just haven't been studied or translated.
Maybe someone who watched this podcast.
Yes, exactly.
If someone is watching us,
someone
please.
wants to do a specific research and is fond of this and has these capabilities, please.
For a PhD project, it would be perfect, I think.
Yes, I think that would be a very good way of going with it. Yeah.
So again, still a lot to be done,
to do, yes,
which is good because this is a very interesting field of study. So yeah, good times ahead.
Yeah, I'm very confident that the 21st century will see a great deal of development in the study of the history of astrology. It's also, I think there's also the question of legitimizing our field of study, because for the longest time history of science has been responsible for looking at the history of astrology, and most of the time there's almost like this embarrassing tone, like, yes, astronomers used to believe in astrology, but we don't do anymore, but it's important to the history of astronomy. Yeah. So let's just talk about the astronomy side of astrology. And then I've tried to convince religious studies to take astrology seriously. I say, look, the Christians, the Jews, the Muslims, the Taoists, the Buddhists, everybody practiced horoscopy in the past. So we should teach Introduction to Classical Astrology in the classroom to undergraduates, and then they can apply what they have learned, and when they read Augustine and Augustine is criticizing astrology, they'll get an idea of what he was criticizing precisely. And if you look at the old worldview of horoscopic astrology in the Hellenistic and the Mesopotamian world, it's polytheist. They viewed the planets as gods. That's why we still call them Jupiter and Mars and Venus. And so it's religion. I think it should be treated as an area of study within religious studies. But what I've discovered is that a lot of committees and research funding bodies, they don't like this idea. So one thing we have to do is just try to legitimize our area of study. So the history of science has problems with it, and religious studies has problems with it. And so we're sort of straddled outside of the mainstream. But I think if we keep pursuing this and producing good research, then in the long term we can kind of create a field onto itself.
We have to create a field. Also, when it comes to the history of science, and we are both in the history of science field, the problem is the word science as it is understood today. Because science today evokes this idea of, you know, laboratories and mechanical repeating and testing. So people tend to move away from it, like exact sciences. And it's almost offensive for a non-historian to think that astrology could fit into this field. And also for historians of science, they don't want to be, associated with it. So
the wretched scientists are still alive, unfortunately.
What we do, we try to explain, and sometimes we manage to get to finish the sentence. We try to explain that it is science in the etymological sense of knowledge, the history of knowledge. And the other thing that people argue is that this field is interesting only for a few half a dozen crazy people. What we argue is just what you said. It's like astrology is interesting not only for people who study astrology, but for historians in general, for medievalists, for people who study classic culture, for people who study mathematics, for people who study astronomy, religion, medicine, literature, all sorts of things, because the way astrology is not just a practice, is a way to explain the world. So in pre-modern times, this was present, and this was the way people agreed and talked about when they were explaining the world to each other, whether they were astrologers or not. Same way that we now talk about DNA or atoms or whatever, and we all agree about this. And I'm sure that a few hundred years from now, people will be criticizing our ideas.
Right.
So it is just the way they were talking about this. So it is also relevant for all sorts of studies that address at least the pre-modern world. So yes, I think I totally agree. We have to create a field.
A field, a field of history of astrology, which then can be applied in religious studies, cultural studies, scientific studies, literature, art.
Art also, yes, I forgot.
Oh, art history too. Definitely art history. That's something that it's very understudied, especially when you go into the Eastern world.
I would imagine, yes. Here we already have some interesting works on iconography of.
His MA was about the representations of science and astrology.
Yes, not completely astrology. It was also medicine, but yes, it's a very interesting topic. The way that certain concepts are then expressed into images, and it has been looked upon, but not in depth yet. But I imagine in the West, in the East, things probably are still a lot to explore. And I know I thought very curious the papers and the discussions you do about these images coming in, and you can recognize certain traits of the astrological conception within the images that are produced in a completely different cultural context.
Right.
Fascinating. For instance, I saw once, I think it was like in a Jewish synagogue, I don't remember, the representation of a zodiac, and instead of the sign of Virgo, we had only two hands, like embroidering.
Oh, interesting.
Not a woman, just two hands, embroidering, making embroidery. So it's completely different, but we know what it is. We understand. We understand what it is. It's a Virgo, a virgin, a woman, a young woman. Also, the virgin can be like a mermaid. Sometimes it is. So
there's a whole field there as well. Art history is also. I think art history of all fields. I think I might be wrong at this, but I think it has been the most opened field to accept the understanding of astrology and as a means to understand representation in general. I think Abby Warburg, those studies were pioneer in the sense that they open up that field of study, and perhaps it is the least resistant to study this kind of phenomenon. But other fields can be quite close.
Well, I think art history is very much concerned with the representation of the divine and Christ and religious figures. So I think also looking at representations of astrology isn't offensive to scholars of art history. Whereas I find in religious studies there's this sort of hesitation, if not embarrassment. Because, and it's also a lot of times too, as scholars, whether they're conscious of it or not, are often following a theological line. So I published a paper about astrological determinism in Indian Buddhism, and nobody has ever pointed this out before, that hey, Indian Buddhists all believed in astrology except for a few very rare skeptics, because everybody has fairly thought, well, Indian Buddhists believe in karma, which is that your actions in past lives determine your experiences in this life, and then your karma in this life will affect your future lives. So it's not entirely deterministic, but it's semi-deterministic, but it's based on action, not on the movements of the stars or of the gods and so forth. What you find is that when you look at the Indian literature, Buddhists all believed in astrology, but nobody had pointed that out before. So what happens, I feel, is that in religious studies that there's a tendency to not all scholars do this, and this is a very general statement, but what I've noticed is that they tend to follow the theological line. They tend to be sort of influenced by the prescriptive rather than the descriptive. So, according to Augustine and according to various other Christian authors, you are not supposed to be practicing astrology if you are a Christian. But when you look at Christian history, you have even William Lilly. He's writing Christian astrology, and Christians were practicing astrology all the time, and they still do.
And I can give you the example of my research and my PhD, which is exactly the Jesuits. And the Jesuits are not only practicing, they're also teaching astrology.
They are priests.
And everyone thought that, until a couple of years ago, everyone thought, well, the Jesuits will not touch astrology because they are in the side of orthodoxy, so they will be promoting the sanctions on astrology. And that's, as always, things are not exactly that simple, and they're more complex, and there are debates within themselves, within the hierarchy, what they can do or what they cannot do. And well, let's hope that's when it's done.
This is a discussion that we should bring also to the students, because, for instance, we had taught seminars on astrology and astrology proper at university, and for students of mathematics, philosophy, different areas, and they come in like a bit like, well, I wouldn't say ashamed, but a little bit embarrassed.
Yes.
But then we begin talking and they get less inhibited, and it's so interesting to see how they are eager to get this information, and how this information fits into something that they were missing in their own fields, even if it's not astrology, because it's such an integral part of our culture that they can finally have the missing link, so to say.
Right.
In different areas, and I'm talking about different areas. So it is also, and also religion. So when people get less ashamed of this kind of difficult and strange thing, they do earn a lot. They gain a lot from it.
They finally can understand the context in which
Right.
they practice and how thought is organized in a certain culture, a certain time. Yeah.
Also from a purely commercial point of view, I think if universities were to entertain the idea of having introduction to classical horoscopy, they would find that those courses would fill up very quickly.
I'm sure they would.
They always want courses that students will take, because then that's good for the university budget. So I mean, it's something I've tried to convince. Departments to seriously consider this. I mean, there's very few. Relatively amongst active scholars, there's very few people who could teach classical astrology. But if there is somebody who does do it, and they could do it well, I think the students would love. I mean, on the first day, the students would be like, I want to look at my birth chart. And that's the first thing they would want to look at, right? And so you could have it over the course of 3 or 4 months of the course. You teach the doctrines of classical horoscopy, and then whether they believe in it or not, they can at least like look at their own chart and interpret it as somebody in like medieval Europe did, or in the Hellenistic age would have looked at it.
And even if they want to criticize, at least they know how to criticize.
They know what
they know what they're criticizing.
Yes, at least they know.
Most of the time they don't. So
because when they talk about ancient astrology or medieval or pre-modern astrology, they think about contemporary astrology, which is completely different.
Right.
And well, it is completely different, to say the least. So at least they knew how to criticize and what they were.
Right.
I think it has been tried before, because I recall reading. I don't recall exactly which book was it, but there was an introduction on a translation of an Arabic work from a Spanish professor in the university, in which he stated that he would teach, before discussing ancient science, I think it's Arabic science, so a little later period, but he would teach rudiment and fundaments of astrology with tetrabibles and other main texts, so that at least the students would know what they were talking about and what they're translating. And I think he would encourage them to experiment with their own charts and apply it to their own lives, so they see how that would happen in other times, so that they would have practical knowledge. And yeah, I think it's a good idea. It has to be done properly, or the problem is it can turn into a circus very quickly.
Yes, it can.
And I can understand that certain universities would be a bit hesitant in bringing that in, and then you have the scientific hardcore posture that would be utterly against such a thing. And
so this is the uniqueness of astrology. Even the academic study of the history of astrology is that it's something that both the hard scientists and the theologians can both disagree should not be in the university.
Exactly.
Yes, and yet some of them understand, because the head of our department, history of science, he does understand. He's not even into astrology, but he understands its importance. So, and people who study medieval culture, medieval science, they do have to incorporate some knowledge of astrology.
Yes. When returning, for example, for art history, we can see a lot of times basic astrological iconography, and I'm not talking about the zodiac, but planets or other misunderstood as calendrical things or representation of the weekdays or so, the months, and they're not. We're talking about astrological representation, which is absolutely embedded in that mentality and that culture, and they don't know about it. It's not taught.
Or like, for example, the Anti-Kefir Mechanism, which was fished out of the Mediterranean in Greece. The descriptions of it, they always say, "Oh, it was to calculate astronomical positions," but nobody wants to say why somebody would design that and why somebody would spend lots and lots of money to have one of those built and shipped across the sea. That was for astrology.
Exactly.
Of course, they don't need they don't need the position of the planets for anything else. Sometimes they say it's for navigation.
And
the sun and the moon and
calendars,
but not. Why do you need the position of Jupiter for navigation? I don't know.
Yeah. Right. Well,
I'm not sailor, but
right. It's also when you're sailing across the Mediterranean, it's a bit easier than sailing on the open oceans.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, but that's true. That's something that we encountered completely. So it is. Oh yes, they have these tables, and they spend huge amounts of money in producing tables and books and for the astronomy and for navigation.
Only.
And you start looking at it and say, no, it's not. This is
right.
Completely astrological practice. Yes, it can be applied to medicine. It can be applied to meteorology, of course. But it's astrology, and it's difficult for them to swallow that and accept that that's the case, and that's okay. It's time.
Yeah, I think with our seminars we open a little bit of space, but we still see people saying that they don't want to say things like astrological medicine, for instance. So they go for iatro medicine or some other name. Yeah, some other name. Let's call it some other name because this. We cannot say the word.
So we avoid astrology at all costs.
We avoid the A word. So it's kind of interesting to see. But it's also
better.
It is also interesting to see how people, when they lose the inhibition, how they react with a lot of curiosity. Especially when they understand the difference between this, what has been done today, and it's really not that good, and what was astrology in pre-modern times. So when they understand this, they are finally at ease to go there without being confused with other people. Other people. That is very interesting to see. Well, a lot of work to be done.
Exactly. Definitely. Hope that this project, your project, and all that work we've been doing and will do, if all goes well, into the research of astrology, will establish a discipline of the history of astrology more properly, which is not dependent on other fields to exist, which is a problem that you were pointing out. It's always in
and it's also important that we keep communicating with each other, even if it's different periods, different cultures, because it's so important for this exchange of ideas. Because as you just demonstrated, things are not straightforward. They change. People communicate. People travel.
And astrology and horoscopy in this sense, astrology in this sense, it's much more universal and global. Much more global phenomenon that usually it's taken for. Usually we are very Eurocentric in a way of looking at astrology, and it's
kind of a universal concept.
Yeah, it's all over the ancient world and deals with all the civilizations that we historically have the map.
Okay. Well, this was a pleasure speaking to you, and
pleasure.
Yes. Best of luck with the website and the podcast and everything. I mean, I'm very much looking forward to this, and I will definitely introduce your podcast to all of my colleagues. I think they'll get a lot out of this.
Thank you.
Yes, we intend to do more, and of course you're invited if you have a paper, a specific topic that you would like to discuss, and please let us know, and
we'll keep in touch.
We'll keep in touch.
Definitely, definitely.
Take care of this. So
that's good.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. So have a good night then. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.